So we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to the February installment of the Sustainability Leadership Presentation Series. Central Community College is glad you've decided to join us today for this presentation. We are also very fortunate to have such a great group of partners this year, including the Center for Urban Sustainability at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, Jesslyn Institute for Sustainable Communities, Metropolitan Community College, the University of Nebraska Lincoln Environmental Studies Program, and WasteCap Nebraska. So a couple of housekeeping items. All attendees are currently in listen-only mode to prevent any background noises, but you are invited to ask questions throughout the presentation, and you can do that in a couple ways. So one is to put questions directly into the WebEx chat box. Another way is if you are in a live viewing room, you can give those questions to your room host, and they will put them in the chat box. And lastly, you can ask questions through Twitter using the hashtag SLPSThursday. Greg will be taking questions periodically throughout his presentation, so feel free to send those questions at any time. We are very excited to have Dr. Gregory Norris from the International Living Future Institute speaking today on manufacturing and selecting net positive materials. So some of you may remember a previous SLPS from the Institute on the Living Building Challenge, and this one will be on the Living Product Challenge. So Dr. Gregory Norris is an internationally acclaimed life cycle analysis expert. In addition to serving as the International Living Future Institute's chief scientist, Greg is the co-director of the Sustainability and Health Initiative for Net Positive Enterprise within the Center for Health and the Global Environment at the Harvard School of Public Health. He has taught life cycle assessment at Harvard since the late 1990s. Greg is also the founder of New Earth, a nonprofit institute developing technologies that enable people across the globe to drive sustainable development from the bottom up. So thank you for presenting today, Greg, and I will now pass things over to you.
Great. Thanks, Olivia. And I'll turn on my camera here just to say hi to everyone. When we get into the presentation in just a moment, I'll turn the camera off. But as Olivia mentioned, I'm really eager to invite you to ask questions at any time during the presentation. So I've got the chat window open, and I think Olivia will probably just be collecting your questions and sort of interrupt. And it's really an enrichment, I find, to a presentation like this, if we can get some interaction going back and forth. So do please, send some questions. That would be great. Let me also say that we've got many more slides here than we can go through today, and that's by design. We just sort of overdo it in compiling a set of slides. And there's more information about what I'll be describing today. There you'll find a lot more information available also for download from the ILFI or ILFI website, the Living Future Institute website. And if you just Google on Living Product Challenge, you should find your way right to it. But there's what we call the standard that contains the information I'll be sharing today, together with a lot more information. So, and you can also find out about the different case studies, the companies who are pursuing and some who have achieved living product certification. So with that, I'll turn off the video for the moment. We can bring it back at any time, such as when we're having some question and answers. And let's dive into it here. I'll be talking about the Living Product Challenge, and I'll be spending at least as much time today also sharing the philosophy, the perspective, the worldview that underlies the Living Product Challenge, and which the Living Product Challenge is really meant to bring to manufacturing and to consumers, basically, those of us who make purchasing decisions for buildings, but much more broadly. You probably know the work of the Living Future Institute. It was born and raised focusing on the Living Building Challenge, so it was really created within the sphere of green buildings. But with the Living Product Challenge, we're broadening to really include, ideally, all kinds of products. And you'll see that some of the products that have been certified already have really nothing to do with buildings, but everything to do with a sustainable, regenerative future. So my objectives for today are to help you achieve these learning objectives, namely that by the end you'll understand the key components of the Living Product Challenge. You'll know that just like the Living Building Challenge, it's framed around 7 petals and 20 imperatives, and you'll have a sense of what those are. You'll also hopefully have some information that can help you become an advocate for net positive products. In other words, for manufacturing and really doing business in general that makes the world, it not just makes the world a better place, but that does, we like to say, that does more good than harm. And I'll go into that in some detail in a few minutes. And then you'll have a sense that this is not just a framework waiting for companies to use it, but it's already being used by some small startups and some major corporations that you all know in order to not just get a seal of approval on a product they're already making, but really to transform how they're making that product, and even to make some transformations at the level of the company as a whole. So for the Living Product Challenge, we, and I can't claim credit for this, but the designers at the Living Future Institute selected the butterfly as our image, or the icon, the sort of emblem for the Living Product Challenge. And one fascinating aspect about that particular, the blue Morpheus butterfly that we just saw, is that it's actually not using pigments to provide the color. It instead is actually bending light. This is a microscopic image of the wing of that butterfly, and somehow these tiny fibers in the wing of the butterfly actually are bending light, somewhat like a prism does, and giving us the blue color that's so beautiful that we see. So it's the genius of nature. It's the unconventional engineering genius, I guess, of nature that's highlighted there and in the butterfly, and it's the kind of thing that we really take as inspiration for the Living Product Challenge. The other aspect about all of the different certification systems within the Living Future Institute is this idea of not so much that ILFI is the the beacon of truth, but rather that we set up frameworks that allow companies, architects, communities who are really pushing the frontier and applying the principles of natural design and succeeding. We allow them to really shine and to offer an inspiration to others. So that's inherent in all of the certification systems, and it's very central here to the Living Product Challenge. And the other thing about all of our work at ILFI is that we're really going beyond, and we're setting up frameworks that encourage, that reward, that celebrate designers and architects and now manufacturers who go beyond just the realm on the left here of less bad, of just reducing the negative things we do. Now, I don't want to give the wrong signal. Reducing our negative environmental impacts is absolutely central. It's key, it's fundamental, and it's at the heart of the Living Product Challenge. But sort of like your left hand is instrumental, but it also often needs the right hand to be complete, or our two hemispheres of our brain, perhaps. Likewise, this right-hand side of this slide is also just as fundamental, and that is restorative actions, taking positive actions, so that as we reduce our negative environmental impact, we're also accomplishing good, so that the net benefit is positive. And I want to share more about that concept with you now before we delve into the detailed imperatives. because it's really a fundamental mind shift around sustainability, and it's one that the Living Product Challenge is helping to lead. It's one I think you're going to hear a lot more about in the coming weeks, months, and I hope years. So let me share a little bit about this net positive framework on sustainability that the Living Product Challenge is really capturing and incentivizing and spreading. Once again, let me remind you as we go through these, if you have any questions for clarification, if I accidentally use an acronym or something like that, just send in a friendly chat, and I'm sure Olivia will pipe up and pose your question. I wish we were all present in the same room. I'd love a show of hands how many people are familiar with this time-honored definition of sustainability that comes from the late 80s, the Brundtland Commission, namely that sustainability or sustainable development entails meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And there are two important parts there. It's not just, we're meeting the needs of the present, and we're doing so in a way, ideally, when we've achieved sustainability, that is not compromising the ability of future generations to do the same. We can paraphrase that to an individual level in terms such as this: meeting our own needs, maybe those of our organization, of our family, of our community, whatever it might be, in ways that don't harm the planet or other people. That is a paraphrasing, and it's a shift. But here's one thing about it. We're basically saying that we want to do our business, we want to perform our mission, whatever that might be, personal or organizational, in ways that ultimately cause no harm. Is that feasible? We tend to frame sustainability, I think, in the popular culture now as being all about shrinking your footprint. We tend to ask ourselves, what can I do to shrink my footprint? And we ask companies or nations even, what have you done to shrink your climate footprint? In other words, all the greenhouse gas emissions that you're a cause of. Or what are you doing to shrink your water footprint? All the consumption of water that, for example, we ask that of Pepsi and Coke. And what are they doing to reduce the consumption of water in their supply chains? And this gentleman biking to work here is presumably, he looks like he's perhaps worried about reducing his footprint too. And he's doing it by not driving a car. I want to explain, I'm using the term footprint, and it's in the popular vernacular, but I think it's probably going to be useful to get a little more details today about what footprints are. In a nutshell, they're all the negative impacts of all of the processes or activities that are needed to produce and deliver each of the inputs of goods and services that you and I use to sustain ourselves, or that our organizations use to sustain their work, your universities use to operate, etc. And we look at the negative impacts caused by all of the inputs we need in order to operate over a given period of time, and it's often a year. So we'll talk about what was Coca-Cola's carbon footprint and water footprint for 2016, for example. That's the kind of information. Now, we calculate these footprints by looking at causal connections in supply chains. I mentioned that, if we're going to talk about our universities, the footprint of our university starts by looking at who did we purchase goods and services from, who did they purchase goods and services from, and so on, all the way up the supply chain. So if we purchase electricity, the electric utility may actually purchase power from a power plant, which purchases coal from a coal mine, and so on. And even the coal mine isn't the end of the story, because coal mines purchase equipment and fuel in order to operate, and so forth. So the causal connections that we're looking at in footprinting are basically consumption and commerce. Sometimes for footprints, we also look at, let's say the footprint of Apple Computer will include potentially the footprint of end users using their computers and so forth. But that's part of the story in footprinting. The next thing we do is for each one of those activities in that whole vast supply chain, which includes thousands of processes spanning the globe, for each one of those, we need to look at what greenhouse gases do they emit, how much water do they consume, did they release toxins to the environment, and so on. These green arrows are representative of examples of environmental impacts for which we calculate footprints. We also look at things like injuries to workers, human rights violations, and so forth. Believe it or not, there's even discussion of a slavery footprint. If you Google on that, you'll find out information about that. The thing that I realized after just a few years of doing LCA and a life cycle assessment, and now it's been 2 decades that I've been at this, early on I realized, wait a minute, every product has an energy footprint and a water footprint, a climate footprint, health footprint, and all year long I'm fortunate to be able to use and purchase, consume these kinds of products. And it raised the question, would the planet, at least in terms of things like climate and water and biodiversity, would the planet be better off if I'd never been born? And I have the opportunity to ask audiences often these days, how many of you feel that from an ecological framework or point of view, the planet indeed would essentially, there'd be a bit less pollution in the atmosphere, there'd be maybe a bit more fish or life in the sea, etc. If we personally, or maybe we and our communities had not been born, or if we were not operating our activities. And it's a sad truth that most people say, yes, I feel that way. And it's sad for 2 reasons. Number one, it's a terrible way to understand the importance of our presence or the impacts of our presence in the world. And secondly, we have good reason to have these worries. In other words, there's data backing us up. The thing is, it's an incomplete picture of what's possible, because we've been looking at causal connections of commerce and consumption, and those are real. But thankfully, we have other ways that we touch the world, that we influence the world around us, besides just our footprints. And that's what I want to share with you now for a few minutes, and then we'll dive into the Living Product Challenge, which embodies these principles in a concrete set of criteria of evaluation. If we want to make the world better because we're here, if we'd actually like it to be the case that there's less pollution in the atmosphere, less risk of climate change and biodiversity loss, because we're present, then we call that net positive, meaning you give more than you take. You cause more benefit than harm. And since we can't reduce our footprint or the harm that we cause all the way to 0, we can shrink it, but we'll never get to positive as we shrink it. We need to add something else, and that's this beneficial action, which we call handprints. It's obviously the counterpart, the sort of caring, creative counterpart to footprints. Handprints are impacts that we cause in other people's or other organizations' footprints, reductions, for example, of those, and other impacts that we cause in the world that can be measured in footprint units. I'll give you a few examples. If you gave some LED lights to a friend or a relative, and they use those to replace an incandescent bulb, that's not going to change your footprint at all, but in fact, what it'll do is increase your footprint just a tiny bit, I guess, because you purchased a new light bulb. But you're going to create a much larger reduction in your friends or your relatives' footprint, because the light bulb ultimately saves way more energy over its life cycle than was needed to produce it. And it actually eliminates a lot more pollution than was caused to produce it. So that's a good example of causing a beneficial impact in somebody else's footprint. You could also do the classic action of planting a tree or maybe cleaning up a beach. And those are beneficial acts that create impacts we can measure in the same units as we measure footprints, but they're not really a footprint reduction per se. They're just a benefit. So we're using life cycle assessment to calculate footprints of ourselves and our organizations and the products we buy. And we're using the same life cycle assessment methodology that I showed you very briefly in a few slides to estimate handprints. And that way we do have essentially two sides of our impact that we can compare. This graphic nicely illustrates that we want to essentially lift up or increase the handprints at the same time that we continuously reduce those footprints. And once the blue gets bigger than the orange in this case, the handprint bigger than the footprint on climate, then we become climate net positive. And if we make the same thing true for water, we've become water net positive. I should emphasize that net positive is evaluated one impact at a time. You could be climate net positive and still have a lot of work to do on your water situation. Your water footprint might be way bigger than your water handprint. And of course, that's the case for all of us right now. We're not yet really working on this in an intentional way. But our goal at the Living Future Institute and the goal of the work that colleagues and I are doing in different organizations is all about trying to help people and organizations build a movement in the pursuit of net positive on as many impact categories as we can. And to become net positive, you start by, again, reducing your footprint, and then you grow your handprint, helping someone else reduce their footprint or doing something beneficial or regenerative, as we said. So that perspective is at the heart of the Living Product Challenge. And now I'll take a few minutes to just give you a whirlwind tour of the Living Product Challenge. As I said, you can download much more information in the form of what's called the standard, the Living Product Challenge standard, from the ILFI website. We'd love for you to do that. But I'm going to give you a taste here today so that you know whether that would be of interest. Just like the Living Building Challenge and the Living Community Challenge, we've organized the criteria, if you like, the evaluation points for the Living Product Challenge into 7 groups, and we call those petals, with the analogy of a flower. And these petals are the same labels that you might be familiar with if you've looked at the Living Building Challenge. There's one for place, one on water, energy, etc. And this one might surprise you, beauty down here, or even equity. That doesn't often show up. Those terms don't show up in environmental sustainability, but they're key. They're integral to the work of ILFI, and they're integral to a living product as far as we're concerned as well. I'll skip over that one in the interest of time. There is a label. You can see 2 examples here of products that have been certified as living products. One is a chair. It's actually a wonderful chair. I'm sorry, I don't have one, but they're office chairs from a company called Human Scale. And they actually are the first company to achieve a 100% living product certification. All 20 of the imperatives they've actually met, both for their smart chair and also for a table that we may take a look at. It's it's extremely challenging to even get 11 of the 20 imperatives, and it's possible to still have a certification that shows you're well on your way toward full certification, and you've already achieved a subset of the imperatives. And so that's what this wonderful product, Firewall, which is a rammed earth technology, has also achieved. In fact, there are 3 levels at which companies can pursue and achieve certification. Full certification is all 20, and that's really rare, but we're excited to see that a company's already achieved that for 2 products. Pedal certification means that out of those 7 pedals, you've achieved all of the imperatives for at least 3, and among those 3 that for which you've achieved full certification of the imperatives in the pedal, that needs to include either energy, water, or materials. And then we'll talk about the second point in a moment. The earliest, the sort of the on-ramp to certification is to achieve at least 7 imperatives. And of those imperatives, you notice the language including 4 core imperatives, so I'll explain that. Here's the list of the full 20, and we're going to look at several of these imperatives in a moment, as well as some examples of products that have achieved living product certification in more depth. But here are these pedals along the left, and you can see for each pedal the imperatives which correspond to it. Sometimes they're numerous, as in the case of materials here. In other cases, for water and energy, for example, it's just a single imperative. But it's a challenging one. Net positive water, we'll take a look at, is required to achieve the water imperative. The core imperatives are in dark blue here, and essentially, no matter which level of certification you're pursuing, you can be assured as somebody looking at certifications that any product receiving the Living Product Challenge certification has met all 4 of these core imperatives, and then some additional imperatives that are listed on the label. So these are kind of like the, imperative says necessary, but these are the imperative imperatives, if you will. They're the ones that you just can't avoid, or it can't opt out. Okay, so now we'll take a look. We'll go take a quick tour through these different imperatives. Before I do that, let me just check in with you, Olivia, and see has the chat window been completely quiet?
We have 2 questions if you are ready for those.
That would be great.
Okay, so the first one is, when you reuse metals for manufacturing, there is a certain point where the metal is degraded and can no longer be used for manufacturing. So what are some preventative measures so the material does not degrade?
Mm-hmm. In fact, I guess the key, it's true that as we use and reuse metals, we find that we may introduce alloying elements. For example, I'll use aluminum as a test case. One approach that we can take there is to essentially continuously reuse the metal for the same purpose. I'll just use the example of aluminum cans, beverage cans. If we recycle a beverage can into a beverage can, then we have no need to add the alloying elements, and it could be virtually indefinite that you continue on that path. Over time, of course, there's rust for ferrous metals. I mean, there's always a little bit of loss in any process, and then not all consumers we're not recovering 100% of the metals or any of our recyclable materials, and so there are losses. And I guess a good way to create a handprint on this topic is to share methods that have been proven to greatly reduce wastes or reduce losses or increase recovery, and to reduce the downcycling as much as possible, essentially to keep a material going in a more circular loop. So I don't have a detailed technology to give there, but I think while it's definitely true that recycling has its limits, we've still got plenty of room to improve recovery rates and the efficiency with which we're repurposing materials.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Our second question is, are the handprints sort of on an honor code type system, or is there a way that they can be quantified, since some impacts will be more positive than others?
Absolutely. Just like, some things we do have a tiny footprint. Sending an email has a footprint, but it's tiny, and then taking a flight across the country has a huge footprint. And so thousands of times greater than, in fact, it's more than a factor of 1,000 greater than the footprint of an email, let's say. So we need to understand this same question of degree of impact on handprints. It's not just scoring, it's about impact estimation, number one. And it's very much, handprints are calculated using these life cycle assessment methodologies. And in fact, there's increasing standardization of the methods for calculating handprints, and I think we're going to start seeing third-party certifications of handprints as well. So there's a bit of an honor system to it at the moment, both frankly for footprinting and handprinting. You can get verified, but you do sort of rely a bit still on the ethics of an organization reporting its footprint. And so that'll always be somewhat the case, but we're seeing it's definitely rigorous in its calculation, and it's becoming standardized as well.
Thank you. And then we had one more come in while you were talking.
Good.
How many products are certified under the Living Product Challenge currently? So I know there are 3 different types, so I guess, in all those categories. And then for materials such as insulation, how does the Living Product Challenge compare very different materials, such as recycled newspaper versus denim versus hemp versus recycled glass?
Great. Okay, so 2 good questions there. First of all, I think we're up to 7 certified and over 25 companies or products in the pipeline. So in the pursuit of the certification, and we're still in the piloting year. We'll be ending the piloting year phase this year and sort of into full production mode, I guess you would say. But we've already seen 7 products certified, and as I say, over 25 in the pipeline. And then in terms of materials, the different materials that you mentioned, recycled denim, fiberglass, cellulose, could all be eligible for Living Product Challenge. And in fact, maybe when we delve into the imperatives now, you'll get a sense about how each one would go about that. The Living Product Challenge doesn't tend to, if you're familiar with life cycle assessment, you may be familiar with head-to-head comparisons of different materials for a given application. That's not the spirit or the even the purpose, really, of the Living Product Challenge. Rather, we're actually trying to set up a framework within which several different materials for insulation might be able to produce a living product. And maybe we'll delve into a little bit of those imperatives, because I think that's where people's curiosity is right now.
Okay, thank you. That's all we have for now, so I'll pass it back over to you.
Perfect, and thanks for those questions, everybody. Keep them coming. So we're going to go ahead and just look at these in numerical order real quick, and I'll skim in a few places. Place is really about how you impact the location around where you manufacture. In fact, several of these imperatives relate specifically to the final manufacturing process itself. even though there's a whole supply chain that spans the globe, and there's a use phase for products that can also have impacts, we pay special attention to the manufacturer themselves. Not exclusive, but definitely special. So, first of all, you need to make sure that you're not adversely impacting the habitat quality around the facility where the final product is manufactured. And there are certain categories of ecosystem or ecological habitat that just aren't acceptable as the location for a factory, as you could imagine. But those are, we haven't seen any examples of this. Also, the product needs to not contain materials derived from endangered species. That can include endangered plant species. In fact, that's a low bar, right? What we're seeing is that factories can actually deliver ecosystem services, or they can work with their host environments to collectively deliver ecosystem services so that, for example, there are more pollinators present in the region, including the factory, than there would be if we just left the land the way it was in its natural habitat. That's a tall order, but it's not impossible. You know, you can actually grow coffee in a way that increases biodiversity of a rainforest relative to even the wonderfully rich backdrop of a rainforest. And so it's feasible as well, believe it or not, to operate a factory in a way that provides net ecosystem services. The second thing, the second criteria here for place is to make a contribution to a land trust organization or other organizations that are basically setting aside a bit of the natural earth for to protect them, basically to sustain the ecosystem services that are there. So just a tiny trickle of funding from each living product challenge, you know, chips away at that or makes a tiny contribution to habitat preservation. So that was the place pedal. As I mentioned, water and energy are two pedals where it's just one imperative each, but these are challenging pedals. And let me give you a good taste of that. You probably know, especially with a heavy agricultural, at least some parts of Nebraska being really important for the nation's agriculture, and agriculture being important for Nebraska. A lot of the center of our nation is unfortunately drawing down water much faster than replacement in terms of the freshwater resources there. And so using water as efficiently as possible wherever we can is essential, and it's not just in Nebraska, as you know. We've seen the stories over the past few years about the persistent drought on the West Coast, for example. Net positive water asks a manufacturer of a product to do two amazing things. First, they need to actually make the manufacturer of the product themselves at their facility water net positive. And I'll explain that at the local level. And then secondly, they also need to make the life cycle of the product from cradle to grave, as we call it, net positive as well. So let's break those apart. Essentially, the facility needs to capture rainwater or be responsible for the purification of water resources such that the water used to manufacture the product in question is essentially not drawing down freshwater resources in its area. It's a water self-reliant manufacturing exercise to produce that product. Now, if the factory produces many products, it doesn't have to be a water self-reliant factory as a whole. If, for example, 20% of the production at that facility is the product being certified, then 20% of the water needs of the factory, roughly speaking, would need to be supplied, for example, by capturing rainwater on site. But how about that second step of making the product as a whole net positive over its life cycle? There, the manufacturer needs to basically perform what we call a scoping life cycle assessment to understand what's driving the water consumption over the whole supply chain. I mentioned the example of purchasing electricity, which the power plant then purchases coal, and the coal mine purchases equipment, and so forth. Each of those steps is consuming water, or most of them do. And so this water footprint looks at the total water consumption in the entire supply chain, asks the manufacturer to identify the drivers of that, and then to basically create water handprints, to innovate or innovate the product so that it uses less water. Ideally, the product itself may be even involved in saving water, saving the consumption or avoiding the consumption of water, or maybe working with your supply chain or with customers to help them conserve more water basically than the product uses over its life cycle. So that's the give more than you take example, and you can see how it's quantitatively deployed here for net positive water. Energy, as we transition from water to energy now, and buildings in the Living Building Challenge achieve this water net positive and energy net positive, and that's sort of an inspiration for the on-site net positive in these two imperatives. Energy net positive is almost a carbon copy of the water imperative, so I can go pretty quickly through it with you. Actually, I'll be skipping over it to just say that you need to be energy net positive for the final manufacturing site, and you also need to create energy handprints over the product life cycle or beyond that more than compensate for the energy consumed in the whole supply chain. Now, those are environmental imperatives, but let's just take a quick look at some of the others. I'll go really fast because I've got an eye on the time here. We need to make sure that the product is manufactured in a way that is safe for the workers involved. No serious injuries, and et cetera. That essentially the workers involved in this final manufacturing stage in particular are not put into harm's way through the manufacture of the product. And the product itself needs to somehow contribute, if you're going to achieve human driving, this imperative here, imperative 6, we have to be able to demonstrate that the product is actually helping connect people to the natural world. Perhaps it's been designed in such a way that is inspired by nature. It's using biomimicry, for example, to use nature as an inspiration in its design, or that it's not going to further disconnect people, from nature. Those are qualitative. Most of these are very qualitative, not quantitative requirements. And Living Product Challenge is not shy about mixing qualitative and quantitative. They each have a role. But manufacturers provide the rationale for how their products are achieving each of these imperatives. The materials petal is deep. As you can see, there are 7 different imperatives. And what I actually want to do to just sort of finish up here is say, first of all, you can read about each one of these imperatives, again, in the standard that's downloadable from our website. And I think it's really helpful to just end by sharing a little bit about just a few of the products that have achieved certification. And then we'll still have time for more questions. So as you can see, 7 certified as of the production of this slide deck anyway, which is quite recent, and 25 living products being piloted right now. One nice example is this product called the Garden Tower. It's a little obscured in this picture, but if you look on the right-hand side, you can see what looked like they're orange and they're planters. It's actually a single planter, which is also doubles as a composter. The composting takes place in the center of the planter, and as you compost garden wastes or kitchen wastes, kitchen scraps, for example, that is directly nourishing the soil that is being used to grow the vegetables, for example, that you're growing in this Garden Tower product. And through the combination of composting and essentially vertical gardening, this Garden Tower has the potential to save more water than was used in producing it, save more energy than was used in producing it, and avoid more greenhouse gases that were emitted in producing it. So it's a potentially net positive product on a lot of different dimensions. In fact, another one is that it can conserve. Essentially, it has a land handprint in the sense that the amount of land used in the supply chain to provide the product is smaller than the amount of land used that would be used to potentially grow the vegetables that you grow over the lifetime of the product. So it can be land use net positive, and that means we're freeing up essentially agricultural land to to produce other crops, or we're just reducing the total demand on land. Another inspiring company is this company called Borreo, and they were actually formed very much around the concept of net positive from the beginning. These are a group of guys who recognized the problem of ocean plastic several years ago, and they said, let's find some products we can make out of that recycled plastic, out of plastic that we're going to recycle or obtain by recycling used fishing nets. Turns out the fishing nets are a huge part of the problem in ocean plastic waste. I think they account for something like 20%. You can get the exact number from our website, and of course you can also find Borreo in the web. They've actually certified the resin itself. So shown here are 2 of their products. They produce a skateboard, and they produce these sunglasses. It's the black part of the skateboard and the sunglasses that are the frames for the sunglasses that are made out of this recycled nylon from fishing nets. And these guys are actually focused in Chile. The cool thing, one of the cool things, they have many cool aspects, but one great aspect to the Borreo story is that they also invest in the fishing villages that are recovering these nets. Some of the revenues from the products that they sell go back into those very communities to support projects of the community's choosing. They also take some action themselves. They're actually installing solar at a local school to help them achieve the net positive, the energy net positive imperative. Likewise, they've taken some actions in their local community to reduce water consumption through highly efficient water fixtures. And the last company here, and virtually the last slides, in fact, is Back to Human Scale. The folks that made this chair, there's a photograph of their chairs, and they're the company that achieved 20 over 20, fully certified. And as I mentioned, the Living Product Challenge, you saw how these companies are doing things. I didn't actually mention it for Garden Tower, but they're replacing the fossil-based PE resin that they've been using. They're replacing with a bio-based polyethylene replacement from. They're actually sourcing from. It's made in part by waste sugarcane agricultural waste from sugar production, and so all of these companies are changing how they make their products as a result of the Living Product Challenge experience. And Human Scale actually tells the story about how pursuing the Living Product Challenge has rippled through to cause changes throughout the company, not just how they make the product. But one other exciting thing about, for example, this chair, you don't know if you can tell, but there is nylon used at several places in this chair, under the frame here, under the seat, and down here the support. And they're actually switching from fossil-based nylon to recovered recycled nylon from Borreo. As I mentioned, Borreo has actually certified the resin itself. And so we have a nice collaboration between two different Living Product Challenge manufacturers. So that gets us to the end of the slide deck here, in time for a few more questions, I hope.
Yes. So the first one is there a website or way to compute a handprint like that of finding your footprint?
Great question. Not one that I would recommend. We have produced collaboratively the International Living Future Institute and the organization at Harvard, which I also work with, Shine. We produced a website that's more usable by manufacturers to help them calculate the handprints of, for example, product innovations. It is something that we're working on very much, is to create a website and a set of apps that people can use to estimate their handprints and to basically strive toward net positive. And if you're interested in that, definitely send me an email and we can give you more information. It's if you check out handprinter.org, you'll find an original beta web app that it sort of shows the direction that we're headed on that. Handprinter.org. It links to an app, but some serious progress is underway to essentially go beyond that beta, which was originally created several years ago now.
Okay. One question is, would you mind going back to slide 2 or 3? There was a graph shown.
Okay. I think I know the one you're talking about.
One of them just have sound at that point, so they just wanted to know kind of what it was about.
Is this the...
Yes, I believe that is it.
Okay, let's take a look here.
So if you maybe just want to give a quick overview of what you said at this point. They didn't have sound, so they don't know what you said.
Okay. So I'm not sure at what point they picked up with us, probably while I was explaining footprints and handprints. What I was really saying in relation to this slide in a nutshell is that both sides of this story are important. And, you know, sometimes I like to say less bad gets a bad rap. We need lots of less bad. The thing is, so that's, you know, reducing a negative environmental impacts. But as I've explained, and I'm sure you've all picked up through the course of the presentation, we need to complement the continuous reduction of negative impacts with the creation of restorative or beneficial impacts. So that one way to think of this slide is also showing the net result of all that we're doing. We're continuously reducing our negative impacts, and we're growing our restorative impacts, and ideally we're achieving net restorative But I also mentioned on several subsequent slides that it's important to sort of keep a little humility and say, look, all of us, whether every product, every person, and every organization will still always have a footprint. And one of the things that maybe I'll mention here quickly that I love about handprinting is, you may have noticed, to create a handprint, you have to help someone else reduce their footprint. So we've tended to remember this guy on the bike. Let me see if we can get to him. He's sort of an illustration of the lonely view of sustainability. It's all about him reducing his footprint. Well, handprinting says, we actually got to help one another reduce our footprints, and we got to accept help from others. And we need to ultimately recognize that we'll never have zero footprint. So we need to commit to those restorative actions that complement the footprint reductions that we're also pursuing. So that's the main message I try to convey with this slide. It also tries to position the Living Product Challenge as way out in front, and I think that's a pretty fair assumption, but or a pretty fair assessment. But that's not my message here. My message is that this is a journey from left to right and from sort of below the line to ultimately net restorative, net positive.
Okay, thank you. And then we have two more questions. So if anybody else has any questions, put those in the chat box, and so we can get to those, or you can use Twitter or give to your room host. So the first of the two is, do you have substitutes for the red list that you recommend, or do they need to be Living Product Challenge certified?
There are quite a few opportunities to essentially find substitutes for red list chemicals, and that is we zoomed right over the material petal, as you may have noticed. Finding safer substitutes is key to several of the imperatives, and they don't have to be Living Product certified to be good alternatives. Basically, we've partnered with several of the other material evaluation systems and continue to strengthen those partnerships. And in fact, part of the Living Product Challenge is about building out a library of safer substitutes on materials, so that people can, so that it's public knowledge and increasingly available information how to find safer and healthy replacements for not only red list materials or chemicals, but also just other material constituents for manufacturing that may not be on the red list, but are known to also be highly toxic or highly risky for human and other life. So definitely don't have to be Living Product certified to be a great substitute for a red list or another harmful material. And making those substitutions is part of the some of the material, the net positive material health imperative in particular.
Thank you. And then our last question is, do you see this initiative being like a LEED certification?
We'd love this certificate. We'd love this initiative, the Living Product Challenge, to be as widely known as LEED. That's a long shot, isn't it? I mean, LEED has achieved amazing public recognition. Probably many of us, our grandparents, have heard of LEED at this point. So in that sense, we'd love to see it. One thing about the Living Building Challenge and the Living Product Challenge as well is that remember that lighthouse, I think it's back here, the lighthouse picture. It's safe to say that the Living Product Challenge, like the Living Building Challenge, is really trying to celebrate and encourage trailblazing. And so I think LEED is definitely encouraging greener construction and more sustainable construction, and LEED evolves over time as well. I think LEED addresses also sort of a much broader swath of construction than does the Living Building Challenge. However, more and more universities, for example, are pursuing, they sort of want to pursue right at the frontier on sustainability. And so we're kind of complementing the LEED style approach, if you like, with the certification systems of the International Living Future Institute. We're trying to really, again, celebrate and help encourage manufacturers, in this case, to push our frontier of what we all consider to be possible or feasible in manufacturing and sustainable manufacturing.
Okay, so that is all the questions we have. So thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Greg. And then Greg mentioned there is a PDF of the standard for the Living Product Challenge, and so that's online at the ILFI website for those of you interested in downloading it. So our next presentation will be next month, and it's from the Center for Urban Sustainability at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and that's on March 2nd, and that will cover transportation systems. Also, Central Community College is currently planning our Earth Week events for April, so be on the lookout for more details on that as the date draws near. And so that's it. Thank you again, Dr. Norris, for presenting, and thank you to all of our viewers for attending.
It's my pleasure, and thank you, all of you.